Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. Today's program is a book review. The well-known conservative commentator Ben Shapiro has out a new book, The Right Side of History, How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. And we need to cover this book for a number of reasons. This will probably make number one on the New York Times best-selling list. And we should compare major cultural influences to what the Bible teaches. I sense that conservative media, commentators on CRTV, The Blaze, The Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro's 3-hour radio program is having an effect upon the culture. People on the left are taking notice. They're beginning to question some of their assumptions. The leftist wokeness on college campus is falling out of favor with the public. Amherst College recently put out what they call common language document, listing all of the political correct things you can say or can't say, redefining words like capitalism and race. The booklet was identical to George Orwell's 1984 Newspeak, where Big Brother has to control the language if it's to control the people. The left is actually doing what George Orwell predicted the left will do, because Orwell saw what was happening in the Soviet Union. Secular humanism will always seek to suppress the truth in unrighteousness, Romans chapter 1. But anyway, the president of Amherst took down the document off their website and apologized for it. And this would not have happened if it weren't for the cultural influence of the conservative media. If it weren't for the voices on the right, the left in a heartbeat would turn America into a Soviet-style communist state. Also, Senator McConnell forced the Senate to vote on AOC's new Green Deal. The vote was 57 noes and 43 present. The Democrats didn't even have the moral fortitude to vote yes or no. And not a single Democrat who sponsored the bill voted in favor of the bill. Why? Because the conservative media has done a great job in informing the public on the lunacy of this bill. More and more people are hearing from the right. The Democrats knew that voting for this bill would put them at odds with the voters. Third evidence of the effectiveness of conservatives speaking up: the leftist hate group Southern Poverty Law Center is in big trouble. The founder was fired over sexual harassment and racial bias, and come to find out that the whole organization is really a do-nothing organization built to get donations from gullible liberals. And criticism and investigation coming from the right help expose this group. And a fourth piece of relevant news, as we all know, the Russian collusion hoax perpetrated by the left has been exposed as a fraud. And again, the conservative news media, holding the left accountable, played a significant role in this exposure. So for all the bad things happening in America, God has given to our nation some communicators, some spokespersons who put forth a great effort to disciple the American people in the Christian worldview. As Ronald Reagan said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. So Shapiro's book is just one more piece of offensive armor in the culture war. And another reason why we should look at Shapiro's book is because this book covers Shapiro's understanding of the whys, the hows, the wherefores in the culture war. And his ideas, his analysis represents many conservatives. And I want to discuss his analysis because he comes so close to the truth and then veers off and misses it by a mile. The biblical assessment and solution is ignored, maybe out of sheer ignorance, maybe out of self-righteousness. Many people, even evangelicals, might read this book and think, wow, Shapiro is right on. He does a great job of analyzing the philosophical errors that have led to America's moral corruption. He writes about the abandonment of God and reason and the need to get back to founding Western values. So what possibly could be wrong with this book? Well, a lot. Shapiro does not present the gospel, the good news of the new covenant, the very assessment and solution put forth by the Word of God. And this is just another reminder that many people think they know the gospel, but they're actually clueless. For them, the gospel is simply choosing a theistic moral path, but that is not the good news. And the best way to explain what something is to explain what it is not. And Ben Shapiro's book is a great example of what the gospel is not. It's a great example of what will not save America. Now, if I were to critique a book by Hobbes or Hume or Nietzsche or some other work by someone on the political left, it would be very easy to point out the atheistic moral relativism. But when it comes to books by conservatives, the error is far more subtle, because the writer speaks about God and morality and personal accountability and rights coming from God. But the Pharisees of old could have written the same. And what did Jesus say about the Pharisees? Matthew chapter 23, verse 15, "Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte." You write lots of books, you have lots of programs. But when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Doesn't sound like Jesus was very approving of these God-centered moralists. And this was a shock to them as much to the rest of the public, who considered the conservative party of the Pharisees to be the epitome of moral rectitude. The Apostle Paul criticized these theistic moralists in Romans chapter 2. He writes, "You rely upon the law and you boast in God, and you know his will, and you approve the things that are essential, being instructed out of the law. And you're confident that you yourselves are a guide to the blind and a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of the immature, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and of the truth." Well, that all sounds good. But then Paul goes on to explain that these people are not the people of God. They're damned to hell. Now, this doesn't mean that secular liberalism is right because moral Phariseeism is wrong. Both are wrong. The truth is a third thing, something totally outside the purview of mainstream conservatism or liberalism. The truth is the new covenant. John chapter 3, verse 3, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a man is born again, he will not see the kingdom of God." And I'll go into the significance of that truth in a moment. But before I get to this book review, I want to say a general word about these conservative pundits. I'm fascinated by their place in the whole eschatological scheme of these last days. We have cultural commentators like Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, Mark Levin, Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, etc. And Christians appreciate the work of these men. They're pushing back against the moral and the economic corruption in our culture. They have somewhat of a theistic worldview, but they certainly fail to communicate the essence of God's truth, God's solution, the gospel. They are acting like the law, giving the nation a knowledge of sin. Romans chapter 3, verse 20, "Through the law comes the knowledge of sin." Or Romans chapter 7, verse 7, "The law is holy and right and good. I would not have come to know sin except through the law." And Galatians 3:24, "The law is our schoolmaster," or our tutor. Or how about 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8? "But we know that the law is good. if one uses it lawfully. Realize the fact that the law is not made for righteous persons, but for those who are lawless and rebellious, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, or murderers and immoral men and homosexuals and kidnappers, liars and perjurers. That's what the law is for, and that is the American public. They need the law explained to them. So I've often wondered why God raises up these commentators. And my guess is they simply played the role of the Old Testament law, not giving the gospel, not providing any permanent solution or change, but simply showing the unsaved the irrationality of their ways, so that in the end, the ungodly pursue a course that flies in the face of rational behavior. And so God is using these pundits to point out the lunacy of this generation. But a question that comes up in this is, why isn't the church taking the lead here? Why is Ben Shapiro the one doing the 3-hour-a-day radio commentary rebuking the culture? Why is he the one writing the book pointing out the philosophical errors? Where are the pastors? Where are the evangelical leaders? Aren't we supposed to be the prophets? Are we so secluded behind the walls of our churches that we fail to fulfill the Great Commission? The Matthew 28 command to teach people all that Christ has commanded? Well, maybe either the church leadership is negligent, or maybe the church leadership is ignorant and doesn't understand these things, so we can't speak to the culture. Well, let me give you a third reason to consider: the offense of the cross. Rather than blaming the church, consider what Jesus said. If they persecute me, they will persecute you. If they do not listen to me, they will not listen to you. All the pastors I know are willing and knowledgeable and talented, but as Stephen said to the leadership of Israel in his day, which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who had previously announced the coming of the righteous one. A conservative pundit who leaves out Jesus Christ and salvation will get the larger audience. The general public doesn't mind someone coming along teaching values and ethics, even when they're based on somewhat of a theistic worldview, as long as you don't bring up the person and work of Jesus Christ. This is 1 Corinthians 1:18. For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. And then Paul goes on in verse 22, for indeed the Jews ask for signs, and the Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. To the Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness. Jesus Christ is not that popular. So this is why these conservative pundits have the shows and sell the books. Don't assume it's the indifference or the neglect of the Christian community or Christian leadership. Remember 1 John 4:5. They are from the world, therefore they speak as from the world, and the world listens to them, not to us. So who's going to get the huge audience? Or in the words of Rush Limbaugh, who's going to have more fun than a human being should be allowed to have? I mean, who's going to make the $85 million a year salary and have a plush Palm Beach estate? Well, it's not going to be the prophets of the Lord. Hebrews chapter 11. The prophets were wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. Immorality sells. Morality sells. But the person and work of Jesus Christ does not sell in this fallen world. So, now let me quickly cover Shapiro's book, The Right Side of History. Shapiro begins with a review of our social problems, the political polarization, the immorality, the greed, the grievances. And he explains that the problem is not because of economic divides, not because of racial divides, not because of technology. There are all sorts of wrong, godless explanations for the current cultural problems, which then lead to wrong prescriptions. Shapiro understands that modern man has thrown off the ideological foundations of Western thought, and so modern man is reverting back to paganism, where the ancients didn't believe in God, didn't believe in singular truth, but worshipped idols and worshipped man. The ideological foundation we're throwing off is Genesis 1:26. We are created in God's image. And modern society is throwing off everything that flows from that truth. That there is a God who has laws, and these laws are above us. These laws do not come from us. And that there are human rights that governments must protect. And Shapiro then goes on to explain the ideological foundations of Western thought, the ideology responsible for Western advances and success, and that is Jerusalem and Athens. And throughout the book, he talks of these two cities as representing two sources of truth. Jerusalem gives us divine revelation, the Bible. Athens deduces truth from natural revelation, what God reveals to man in nature and conscience. Romans chapter 2, verse 14. Even before the law was given, the Gentiles instinctively discerned the moral law of God. Now, we tend to think of Athens as being paganism and idolatry. As when Paul, he went to Athens and he confronted the idolatrous pluralism. And in 1 Corinthians 1:21, Paul writes, the world through its wisdom didn't come to know God. Where's the wise man? Where's the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? The church father Tertullian said, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? And Tertullian was pointing out that the wisdom of man is antithetical to divine revelation, the Bible. So it'd be easy to assume that Shapiro is in error here, but Shapiro is pointing to the earliest Greek philosophers who deduced that there is a God, that there are higher morals, and that mankind must submit to universal morals in order to find happiness. And this is a far cry from modern relativists who are saying that there is no higher law, and that law is simply a function of human utility or social construct. Shapiro is referring to the fact that our founding fathers, Western thinkers, used to believe in universal absolutes, the law of nature and nature's God. And this is natural law, described in Psalm 19. The heavens are declaring the glory and the nature of God, even to those who don't have the Bible. True reason is part of God's law. And that is why postmodernists, cultural Marxists today, are rejecting Aristotelian logic. They're seeing it as simply a social construct made up by white people to maintain power. Because logic and reason means that somebody is right and another person is wrong. It means that there is a higher law outside of ourselves, something that can judge our conclusions. And that is something that the leftists hate. They want raw power and will, no external judge. And so now they reject logic and reason as being simply a social construct. So Shapiro explains that the new pagans in our culture want to throw off natural and written law because when you see yourself as God, you are the source of truth. Nothing can come from without. The bulk of Shapiro's book goes through the development of Western thought, those who believed in natural and written divine law. Then he covers the secular philosophers in the Enlightenment who made it their life's work to find some way to live without God. And this is a good read. You need to get out a pen and write down some of the good quotes he pulls from Voltaire and Hobbes and Hume. You may need some of these quotes in your witness. because often Christians need to explain the devil's lies to the unsaved. The book is a quick overview of Philosophy 101 from a theistic point of view. And if you've never learned these things, it's a must. You'll understand what's happening in the world in a whole new way once you understand how these philosophers and philosophies remove foundational truth. One of my favorite quotes, which is not in the book, is that a liberal, a leftist as they're now called today, is one who thinks he can pull out the roots and still have the flower. The ungodly think they can remove God and still have a lawful, peaceful, prosperous, advanced society. But when you remove God's truth from a culture, the culture reverts back to primitive, backward, superstition, violence, indifference, laziness, because God has been removed. The purpose and the source of life. Now, I have to warn you that if you're unfamiliar with philosophy, this book is going to seem kind of overwhelming. But hang in there, read slowly. It may take you a couple of months to process all of the 217 pages. Given Shapiro's subject, the way secular enlightenment sought to unseat God's truth, I recommend that you first read Francis Schaeffer's book, How Shall We Then Live? The Rise and Decline of Western Thought and Culture. Schaeffer, being a Christian, gives a much more biblical assessment of Western history. Shapiro sees some of the anti-God errors in the secular enlightenment, but he neglects some of the more important biblical perspective that Schaeffer addresses. Anyway, these philosophers that arose during the Enlightenment are quite a group to behold. While on the one hand you had the Reformation, people returning to the authority of the Word of God, there were the so-called Enlightenment thinkers. They put forth every possible satanic lie against God's truth, that religion has inhibited human development, that the Christian religion obstructs human advancement, that it was science and rationalism that made the West advance, not the Protestant Reformation, and that even if religion was necessary to build Western civilization, they claim it is only like scaffolding. Now that the building is built, we can remove the scaffolding, the Christian religion, or as they would call the religious superstition. Men like Hobbes, Spinoza, Hume, they didn't believe in God. They tried to find alternative reasons for morality and purpose. Even Hobbes, back in the 1600s, was saying the exact same thing that leftist cultural Marxists are saying today, that morality is a human construct created to establish power relationships in the world. Actually, it was Hume's own animus against God's authority. Voltaire, he didn't believe in God, but stated that the purpose of man was to better human condition. In other words, to live for and to glorify man, to maximize human pleasure, to minimize human pain. Jeremy Bentham wrote that morality should be based on human utility. He wrote that natural rights being from God is nonsense. What matters is the state or the community. And all of these philosophers emphasized the community over the individual. They all emphasized socialism and communism, which is part and parcel with secularism. The French Revolution was to free man from religion and replace the church with the temple of reason. The Declaration of the Rights of Man were all about the rights of the state triumphing the rights of the individual. Morality was to be found by the general will of the people, not the law of God. This was the exact philosophy of the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and his law positivism. After World War I and World War II, the intellectuals lost faith in coming to truth by human reason and science. So they began to promote existentialism, that everything is meaningless. And this is what is often called postmodernism. This was the new skepticism, that not even reason has the answers, not even reason is an authority. So what's left? Live by passion, live by power, live for pleasure, the sexual revolution. And so now the West has returned to paganism. No God, no truth. Ben Shapiro shares a historic, demonstrative moment when back in 2015, he was a panel guest on the Dr. Drew show. The panel was discussing ESPN's decision to award Caitlyn Jenner their Arthur Ashe Courage Award for his decision to announce his transgenderism. Everyone on the panel was in favor of the decision except, of course, Ben Shapiro. Shapiro explained that he did not understand why society ought to engage in the mass delusion that Jenner was in fact a woman. Jenner may call himself a trans woman. Gender may change his name, but gender is not, by any biological measure, a woman. And a society that refuses to acknowledge the biological difference between men and women is engaging in knowing falsehood. The transgender on the panel sitting next to him then called Shapiro an ignorant little boy, grabbed Shapiro by the back of the neck, and threatened to send him home in an ambulance. What is telling in this is that without an argument, when faced with reality, all the ungodly have left is violence. They have no rational cover for their sin, and so they just resort to brute force. Might makes right. And the left is now trying to use violence and outrage to shut down any speech that contradicts their view of the world. This chapter, chapter 8, A Return to Paganism, is one of the best chapters explaining the current ideology on the left, starting with the Frankfurt School, cultural Marxism, this philosophy of oppression and victimhood. This is mankind's final rebellion against God, accusing God and his truth of being the great oppressor. And this is the doctrine of demons. It's now being embraced by the world, and this will lead to the Battle of Armageddon, the final battle against God. But the question Shapiro doesn't answer is why. Why were all of these philosophies and philosophers embraced? Why didn't the people in the West love and defend the Judeo-Christian values of the past? This belief in God and the law of God and that rights come from God. Was it their resentment? Was it their greed? Were the people spoiled by the prosperity brought about by Christian values? Why has the no God, man is God philosophy taken over the culture? If mankind were a blank slate, if it was just up to free will, you think maybe it'd be 50-50? But you see, man by nature is evil, totally depraved. Shapiro speaks constantly of free will as if man can exert himself by his own power, by the power of his will, and return to goodness. But as Martin Luther explained in his famous work, The Bondage of the Will, man's will is imprisoned by sin. His very nature is corrupt, and you cannot change the disposition of your nature. This was the biblical teaching of all the reformers. This is Romans chapter 3, verse 10. As is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seek for God. Oh, men might seek some sort of religion or morality as a catharsis, but no one really seeks the true God and true holiness. John chapter 3, verse 19. This is the judgment, that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light, and doesn't come to the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed. So the real question here is not why has the West reverted to paganism, but why did the West ever embrace any of the Christian worldview in the first place? And this is where we have to acknowledge the supernatural intervention of God, whereby God's Spirit converted a few people, and constrained or hindered the majority ungodly crowd so that a redeemed people could spread the gospel on the earth. So what if God now so chooses to let the ungodly revert to their default position? And that's the prophetic 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 explanation of history. A truth that's not considered by Shapiro or by any other conservative. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 7, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he's taken out of the way. Till the Spirit of God is removed. Then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay. It's not that sociological factors cause so many people in the West to abandon paganism and adopt a Judeo-Christian worldview. And it's not that new sociological factors came along causing so many people in the West to abandon God and turn back to paganism. This was God's work in temporarily restraining man's natural bent, saving souls. Now, Shapiro closes his book with an 8-page chapter entitled How to Build, how to fix or reverse the explosion of godless leftism, paganism. And Shapiro gives the typical Jewish answer. Taken from the Torah, the answer is train your children. And Shapiro begins with the story of Abraham being called to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham honored God. He sacrificed everything for God's truth. But the lesson Shapiro sees in God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son on Mount Moriah is that Abraham had to commit his own children to his ideals, putting his own son in danger of death for a higher purpose. And God is asking us to train our children to defend good against evil. And this is his answer to fixing the anti-God problem in this world. And this is the conclusion many Orthodox Jews come to from their reading of the Torah. Deuteronomy chapter 6, Deuteronomy chapter 11, train your children, and then your days and the days of your sons will be multiplied in the land. The future depends on how well we train our children in the law. It's all up to us. So who's to blame for the social decline? The parents. Their failure to educate. But what caused these parents not to educate? And why are their Jewish children raised in Jewish education who still rebel? Jews such as Karl Marx and Freud and Spinoza and Noam Chomsky and Peter Singer. I mean, there are plenty of children raised in God-centered homes who choose to do otherwise. It looks like education is not foolproof. Consider what Moses said about the people in Deuteronomy 32. They have acted corruptly toward him. They are not his children because of their defect, but they are a perverse and a crooked generation. Was it a lack of education? No, the law of God was something contrary to their very nature. And education cannot change the nature. Teaching the moral law can constrain the rebel for a while and outwardly, but the evil disposition is still there. You say, well, how do we explain the Ben Shapiros of the world? The moralists, the moral Jews. Well, Paul himself, a Jew, said in Romans chapter 2, you moralists who condemn others, you do the same thing. You're cut from the same cloth. There are some people who get their ego needs met by being moralists, but that doesn't take care of their sin problem. The law, or even education of the law, doesn't change the sinful nature. Hebrews chapter 7, the law makes nothing perfect. Paul even calls the Old Testament law the ministry of death. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6, who has also made us adequate as servants of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. But if the ministry of death, in letters engraved on stones, came with glory, there Paul is referring to the law of Moses, as the ministry of death. I recently had a listener who made the point that when the Old Covenant was given, 3,000 Jews died. Exodus 32:28. But when the New Covenant was given, 3,000 Jews were saved. The ministry or the application of the law resulted in death, punishment because of sin. The sinner must be judged. The ministry of the New Covenant, where the law is written on the heart, where the sinner is converted, resulted in the salvation of people. It resulted in life. It resulted in true holiness. Now, this doesn't mean that teaching our children the law of God is the ministry of death, but that the teaching of the law is powerless to save or change the individual or the culture. Therefore, it can bring nothing but judgment and punishment and condemnation. The real message of the Bible, the solution, is the necessity of a miraculous change. That's the good news. A change that can only be brought about by the Spirit of God. As Jesus told Nicodemus, hey, you're a teacher of Israel and you do not understand that a man must be born again? I mean, the whole history of Israel is the cycle of disobedience. And the only way to break that cycle is by a supernatural conversion by the Spirit, where the law is not written on tablets of stone, but by the Spirit of God, the law is written upon the heart. The heart is changed, where Jesus cleanses us from the inside out. Going back to the Old Testament law and education is not the answer. Romans chapter 1, verse 16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. That's the power. Saving faith in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And that is a whole different framework than what is described in Shapiro's book or in the books of other conservatives. The gospel is not about finding a philosophical source of truth and morality and deciding to follow that source. The gospel is about faith and repentance in the Messiah, and then a supernatural change of one's nature, something that is beyond man, something that's beyond man's ability to achieve. It's something done by the Spirit of God. And apart from that kind of change, society will never change, because the root of evil is never removed. And hence, the society will always go toward paganism. So I hope you come to understand the gospel. If you still don't get it, start reading the New Testament and begin with the book of Romans and pray to God for an awakening, for the new birth. So thank you, Ben Shapiro, for writing a book about the law, off of which we can present the gospel. Thank you for making God and country a part of your discipleship in the Word. Philippians 1:27. Stand firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel.